it hurts software companies to be limited by borders. And so I think I kind of think about this problem two different ways. One way is like, okay, I'm going to fund companies that are regulated by governments because like they're insulated from global competition. Banking is a big example. On the other side, I'm thinking, how do I fund software companies that are immune to that? I most recently funded an enterprise software company that sells to banks. These guys are in Central Africa. All the banking software from the local bank comes from France. Basic banking stuff, but none of the relevant features for the region. And it's crazy to sell a big bank software when you're a two-person startup. But the 5% bet is that like we can cross the borders. A lot of what I'm trying to figure out is how to cross borders. And the second thing I think about a lot is other areas where you can go cross-border where being on the ground matters, right? So like we funded a company that does auto parts distribution.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you can't do that from the cloud. Like
Yeah.
some motherfucker has to hand people parts,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm just looking at all of these areas where it's insulated from global competition, it's solving a real world problem, not inventing a problem, and it can move cross-border.
Yeah.
But man, that present, I mean, like that map, that's my problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to pretend like that map doesn't matter.
Right? I get to do that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, but it does. What it just means is that, for example, in 10 years, I see much bigger consolidation place, right?
Sure.
Because if somebody has worked really hard to get Francophone right, and somebody has worked really hard to get East Africa right, or something, you can then just come in as a consolidator and kind of take stake and then get creative, right?
Yes.
But the reality is also, it's also sometimes a competitive advantage for founders who work out how to navigate that map. And there are ways, but it just means it's a bit slower.
Well, what's interesting is often I find myself telling the Nigerian founders, like, you can't copy the US, right? Like in the US, if you're doing something that has on the ground physical element, it probably makes sense to take over the top 10 to 25 markets in the US before you get one international market.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to take the top 25 cities in Nigeria before you move to your first non-Nigerian city? Probably not.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of areas where like people want to copy the thing that worked here, and I'm like, they look at me like, you're saying some really crazy shit. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm saying the thing that works in America won't work in West Africa.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I ask folks, what are the 10 cities that matter to you? Like, what are your first 10 cities, and how many of them are going to be in country?
Okay.
And that's a very different conversation.
And I think an added layer of complexity that I want to address in the context of this conversation also is the nature of African markets, many of them being analog, right? So we talk about mobile money, but mobile money is built on top of a physical infrastructure of agent networks and physical cash in, cash out, human ATMs. And you talked about auto parts.
Yeah.
This idea also as venture investors, right? Traditionally investing in zero marginal cost software businesses versus the very offline nature of African markets. How do you guys think about, investing in companies that have to solve problems that are physical in nature versus the ideal investment case in software businesses?
I would say the way that I'm trying to attempt to solve that problem is pivoting my fintechs from consumer to enterprise. I think the thing that I wanted to believe was that the banks would be disrupted. And like that was the very naive American thing, but it was weird because it's what all the founders wanted to believe too, right?
The banks play a different role.
I just think the banks aren't going anywhere.
Yes, you're not going to, and their role is different.
Well, yeah, and so I've been, for example, we have a card issuing company with a deal with MasterCard, right? And they were originally trying to serve a bunch of fintechs, and eventually I said to them, why don't you just try to sell this to a bank? And they're like, oh, enterprise sales, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, but like Nigerian banks bank the whole fucking country. Like, they actually have the problem, and they actually have a hard time building good technology. Like, you don't have to serve a customer who themselves doesn't have product market fit. You can serve a customer who has customers who want this thing and they just can't provide it. And I've been surprised at how my mind is kind of changed on that, because it just seems like the banks aren't going away. I mean, we just had crypto, infinite investment in consumer fintech, and mobile phones, and the banks are still there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's like, okay, like I'm like process elimination. Maybe we have to work with them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at a macro level, simplistically, just so you understand African banks for everybody here, African banks mobilize deposits from big enterprises, governments, and high net worth individuals and deploy those deposits in treasury bills and federal debt. That's their business model. They're not interested in lending to consumer. They're not interested in building it. They mobilize deposits and buy government paper. That's their core business in a nutshell. So they won't go anywhere because the space you are disrupting as a fintech, they are frankly not interested.
But everyone has bank account.
Yes.
So what do you do with like so? And that's where they get paid.
They're just using it to mobilize deposits.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Buy T-bills,
Yes,
right?
yes,
so
yes.
they're frankly, so when you're trying to like create a credit card for the customer and bank them and, you know, cool tools, they are not interested. They want you to do it. So you work with them.
Yeah.
You do it. And then when it's big enough, they're like, huh, okay, this is big enough. Maybe now we acquire it.
Well, what's interesting is like the dirty little secret of both of the companies I'm pushing towards banks is that the use cases are business use cases, not consumer. Like
Yeah.
one is a payroll use case where like how do you process payroll in regions of the country where there aren't bank branches, and like, you know, how, and it's a big problem. It's a big problem for government. Like how do you pay the army? And then the other one was card issuing for employees, for workers. And so it's been interesting to navigate that because like you have a bunch of founders who are like, oh, like to your point, who are like, oh, consumers are getting screwed, and you've got banks being like, I literally don't care. And like you've got companies, and what do you tell them to do? And you're like, well, you know, if the bank's a customer, maybe you should figure out what the bank wants, and do that. And I think it's going to be interesting because I think it's counterintuitive to think that you could compete in enterprise software against the Western companies, but those large institutions in Africa have different problems.
Yeah.
And like the Western software companies are not addressing them.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see. But it's been tricky, man.